Okay, welcome to our evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Berkun. I am a rabbi at the Shalom Hartman Institute, where I am vice president and run our rabbinic programs, but I also happen to be married to a rabbi who is rabbi here at the Aventura Turnberry Jewish Center, which is why I live in Miami, even though the Shalom Hartman Institute is based in Jerusalem. And it's always such an honor and privilege to teach Torah here in my own synagogue. And in this moment to teach Torah, which is very core to the work that I do at the Shalom Hartman Institute, and also so critical for us to be grappling with in this moment as we find ourselves in this very terrifying and enraging and grief-stricken, heartbroken moment in the history of the Jewish people and in the history of the state of Israel. So I want to jump right in because there's so much to unpack, and there's so much. I know in an hour and a half we won't be able to cover everything I could share with you. I know some of you are very eager to hear about my own trip to Israel. I brought a group of almost 40 rabbis to Israel through the Hartman Institute, where we were volunteering and bringing pastoral care to our Israeli rabbis network at the Hartman Institute. We have rabbis that are ordained at Hartman and that are working throughout the state of Israel to bring spiritual support and communal support to the displaced families, to the hostage families, to families that are grieving and have experienced loss. And I did have the great opportunity and the heart-shattering opportunity to be in Israel for a week with rabbis, to hear a lot of testimony from victims, to hug a lot of my colleagues, and to just be on the ground, really trying as best we can to offer support, moral support through our sense of solidarity, that we are here with you. You are not alone. I think that was the biggest gift that we brought with us, was just helping Israelis feel like they're not alone, that Jews throughout the world are with them and care about them, and to really get a sense on the ground of what Israelis are experiencing. And I can just say before I launch into our topic that it's just a country in trauma, and I'm sure many of you have heard, you know, it's October 93rd, or it's October 97th. In other words, it hasn't moved on. Many of them talk about it feeling like a Yoma Achrita, which is an Aramaic term in the Talmud that means one long day. October 7th has not ended for them. They are still facing, in a very tangible way, every single day, the trauma of the events of October 7th and the aftermath. And they're in the middle of a war, in a war where most everyone that I met has a direct loved one, a spouse, a child, a cousin, a niece, a nephew, someone they know that is serving in Gaza, and that at any moment they could receive a knock on their door, God forbid. So it's a very, very difficult time in Israel, a very painful time. And at the same time, it is a time of just a lot of indignation and anger and fear at the rise of anti-Semitism throughout the world, at the seemingly illogical and nonsensical and Helm, for those who ever studied, Hasidic literature, like Helm means, I don't know, the land of idiocy, or the, incomprehensibility of what's happening at The Hague, that Israel would be brought up on charges of genocide when they experienced a genocidal attack by Hamas. It's too much. It's too much. But we still need to be rational human beings that can learn facts, even if not everyone in the world is open to learning and talking about facts and morality and philosophy and law. But that's what we're going to do tonight because it's important. And I'm very happy to answer questions later about my experience in Israel, but I want to jump right in right now to our topic of ethics of war. It's a topic we've been teaching at the Hartman Institute as part of our I Engage project, and some of you were in my I Engage class a few years ago here, and you had a little taste of the kind of Torah and ideas that we teach at the Hartman Institute. But one of the big projects that we have, which we call iEngage, is a project that brings Torah and ideas to Jewish leaders to help them grapple with ethical dilemmas and challenges that the Jewish people are facing today, and also to help them wrestle with the nature of the relationship between Israel and the Jewish people, Israel and the diaspora. Rabbis in particular have needed a lot of help over the last 10, 15 years in how to teach about Israel in congregations that have diverse political views about Israel and diverse policy opinions about Israel, the peace process, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And how can we have conversations together as a group of diverse Jews who probably have different political opinions in this room? How can we have a shared conversation that's grounded in Jewish values? So that's the overall goal of our project, to try to help Jews really navigate their complex relationship with Israel and have shared conversations around values so that we can be open-minded and compassionate to other Jews that may have different opinions than us. Not the easiest task in a polarized world, in a highly partisan culture, but it is, I can attest to the fact that it is possible to do, and we've done it ourselves here at HEJC in the way that we have studied over the years. Tonight will, I think, be no different, and the question that we're going to ask tonight is, what is a Jewish way to think about the war between Israel and Hamas, a Jewish way through Jewish values, and through moral philosophy and international law? And how can all of those influences that guide the Jewish people in Israel and the conduct of the IDF, how can we unpack all of those elements? What does Judaism have to teach us about power and war? What does international law require of us? And what does the unique situation of waging war against a terrorist enemy demand of us? So I want to start very briefly with the Torah piece, because I really want to get into international law and just war theory, because I think that's where a lot of us are struggling as we read the news and as we see everything that's unfolding in Gaza right now. But I want to say that when we returned to sovereignty in 1948, the Jewish people, for the first time in millennia, had to deal with questions around power that we didn't have to face for the hundreds and hundreds of years that we did not have an army, that we were not allowed to have weapons and defend ourselves. And in some ways, it was easy to be morally righteous around questions of power when you have no power and you have no ability to yield power. And one of the great challenges that faced the Jewish people when we returned to power with sovereignty, with the establishment of the State of Israel, was that we had to come to grips with what it means to be a people of power again. Because for so long, we were often victims, we were often the persecuted ones, we were the minorities that were threatened by those with power, but we weren't the people who had power, and were not only had power, but were a sovereign state in the majority that had power and could wield it against minorities that did not have power. So one of the important tasks of Zionists, and this is a critical part of what the Hartman Institute was founded to do in the 1980s, was to think about a Jewish ethics of power, and it was the moral philosophers at the Shalom Hartman Institute that wrote the IDF Code of Ethics and that trained the IDF officers in morality of war and Jewish values. So we've been, for many decades, thinking about this very much, and I'll just very briefly outline the steps, the conceptual steps through a Jewish lens of how we think about the importance of power to the Jewish tradition and why power is not a bad word. Because one of the things that we struggle with in America when we talk about Israel and our relationship with Israel, especially on college campuses, and with a certain segment of the population that often tends to be younger, is the overarching assumption that power is inherently corrupting, that those who have power are in the moral wrong, and those that are weak or powerless are always the pure ones, are always the ones on the higher moral ground. Maybe you're familiar with this calculation. We see this sometimes in theories of intersectionality, which is a popular theory, especially in progressive circles and in younger populations today. The idea that if you are in a population or a group that is disempowered or marginalized or discriminated against in some way because of your race or your orientation or the group that you identify with, then those who have power are the abusers and the oppressors and the ones that are always morally wrong. And the challenge has been in generating a healthy Zionism for American Jews in the 21st century is that Zionism in Israel gets painted in that kind of power assumption that Israel and Zionists have power, which means they are oppressors and they are in the moral wrong, and Palestinians are powerless and victims and marginalized and disempowered, and therefore they are always in the moral right. And that is how we come to the black and white thinking that has led to a lot of what you see happening on college campuses today. So part of the first educational imperative, and what is so important for us to do as Jewish educators, is to kind of break down that false dichotomy and say, wait, where do you have the assumption that anyone who has power is in the moral wrong automatically, and anyone that is disempowered is automatically in the moral right? You didn't get that idea from the Torah, because the Torah, starting in Genesis 1, teaches actually that God intends for humans to have a great deal of power, as you see in the first source, right? The very creation of humanity says that humans are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, to be fertile, fill the earth, and master it, and rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. So humans are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, to be rulers and masters, to rule over the world. What does it mean that we are in the divine image? It means that we are creators, that we are rulers, that we are masters. Chapter 1 of the Torah depicts human creation, unlike all other creation, as a special kind of creation that God intends for us to be walking images of God in the world, to master the world. And that's where we get, by the way, that murder is such an egregious sin, because if you are killing a human being, you are killing a walking image of God, a divine image. So a few important things we learn right out of the gate from the beginning of the Torah is that humans are meant to be very powerful and to use their power to shape the world, and that the value of human life is infinite. So if you use your power to murder, to take a human life, that is the gravest of sins, an affront to God, and it results in capital punishment according to the Torah in Genesis 9. But here's the deal. You might think, well, then clearly we have to be pacifists, because I've just been told that human life is a divine worth. It's infinite worth. Every human being is tantamount to a God in the world, infinitely valuable, unique, right? Equal. All humans are equally made in the image of God, so no one could ever kill another human being, and so we have to be pacifists. We could never wage war. But this, I think, is an important part of a Jewish narrative of power, which is the idea that one is meant to see themselves as a walking image of God. So if I myself am created in the image of God, as it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you have to first love yourself and know what it means to love and take care of yourself before you can love another. That means that I have to keep myself alive. So a few steps in this Jewish narrative of power. Number one, humans are made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, to rule the world. Very powerful position. But because we're made in the image of God, our life has infinite worth, and you can't take another human life. That would be like destroying an image of God. But it doesn't mean pacifism, because my life too is worth the image of God. I am meant to love myself so that I can love my neighbor as I love myself. And that means I have to keep myself alive. And that's why you've heard all growing up, I'm sure many of you, the concept of pikuach nefesh, that you must do anything possible to keep yourself alive. It's why preserving your health and making sure you stay alive trumps every other mitzvah. If it's Shabbat and you normally shouldn't spend money or drive a car or do certain things on Shabbat, but you're sick, you get in that car and go to the hospital. You pull out the money and you pay the taxi driver to go to the hospital, right? Because saving your life in the image of God is worth the most. That's the most important thing. So how do we come to Jews waging war? Seems maybe problematic with all these principles we've said, but if you look at the top of page 2, if we put all these building blocks together of Jewish values, we learn that if someone comes to kill you, you're allowed to kill them first. We all knew this from American laws of self-defense or international laws on just war, which we'll talk about in a minute. And this is a no-brainer. If someone's literally coming after you to shoot you, you're allowed to do whatever you need to do to keep yourself alive. That's not considered murder. So self-defense that results in killing is different than murdering an innocent human being that Genesis 9 is talking about. And not only are you allowed to kill someone in self-defense, but you're morally obligated. You're morally obligated to do whatever is necessary to keep yourself alive in a just way. And we're not going to read number 6, but if you look at number 7, when we think about going into war as Jews, one of the things that I think is most important for us to keep in mind is the multiple values that we have about human life. So this, I think, is the best text that we can look at before we go into the contemporary sources about war theory and the Israel-Hamas war. This is my favorite. This is in Bereshit Rabbah. It's a midrash, and it's a midrash about Jacob's reunion with Esau. For those of you who remember, Jacob ran away from his brother Esau for like 12 years because he stole Esau's birthright, and he overheard and knew that Esau was so enraged that he planned to murder him. So he runs off, and that's how he ends up in the land of his uncle Lavan, and he marries Leah and Rachel. And remember, he serves Lavan for many years, and then after serving them for many, many years and amassing great wealth, he wants to go back home to Canaan. And he's afraid of what's going to happen when he sees Esau after all these years if his brother still wants to murder him. So he's sending gifts ahead of him, and he's sending off his wives and children to be safe and protected and gearing up for this reunion with a lot of anxiety and trepidation. And what it says is, Vayira Yaakov me'od vayetzer lo. And the verse in the Torah says, Jacob was greatly afraid and was distressed. A better translation is, Jacob was afraid and was really scared. And the rabbis of the Midrash, of the body of literature that interprets the biblical verse, says, wait a minute, the Torah is such a concise text, it's so carefully worded, it never adds words unnecessarily, this is very redundant. It would have been enough to just say, Jacob was about to see Esau again, he was really scared. Why does it say he was really afraid and really scared? So they answer and they say, Amar Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Eli, lo hi yira v'lo hi tzara. According to Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Eli, aren't fear and distress the same thing? Why did the Torah have to say both of them? Ela vayira shelo yaharog, v'yetzer lo shelo yehareg. He was afraid lest he should be killed by Esau, and he was distressed lest he should have to kill Esau in self-defense. He's about to go into battle in his mind. I might be confronting an enemy who's going to want to kill me, and I'm so afraid that I might get hurt, and I'm also so afraid that I might have to hurt someone else. And that's, I think, the best segue into our conversation about the war against Hamas. And what does it mean as Jewish people to be in a period of history where we have a modern state of Israel, an army, and the ability to wage war, and the necessity sometimes morally to defend ourselves and to go into war in order to protect ourselves and preserve our own lives, which is our moral obligation. And what should be the ethical posture of a Jewish people that are going into war? The ethical posture should not be, kill them all, right? That's a discounting of the value of every human, innocent human life created in the image of God that has infinite worth and is equal. Every human is equal in the eyes of God. Nor is the posture, our hands are tied, turn the other cheek, let them just come and massacre us as many times as they want, because we can never touch another human being. We can't ever kill another human being. There's somewhere in between. So let's start to talk about what is this middle ground. And this middle ground is very much related to what in international law we call just war theory. This is not just in Jewish value, but also in international law on war ethics, this kind of balance between what does it mean to recognize the value of human life and our moral obligations to preserve life, and our right and duty to protect ourselves. So let's start with understanding the two aspects of international law as it comes to war, and we'll unpack both of them. So the first thing is called jus ad bellum, which means is the war itself just? The justness of the war. And then we have jus in bellum, which is what we're going to spend most of our time talking about, which is justice in war. Once you go to war, are you fighting that war justly? So the easy one to deal with, lickety-split, I hope I can do this in 5 minutes or less, is what makes a war a just war. The harder one that's going to take us an hour is, if we're fighting a just war, how do we know that we're fighting it justly? Make sense? So we're going to start with just what makes a war just. This is based on international law, Geneva Convention, et cetera, et cetera. Let me start with, sorry, let me just make sure that I'm doing this right. Okay, so in just war theory, just cause is the main indicator that a war is just. What is a just cause? There's only one, so we can all say it out loud. Right? A war of self-defense is the only internationally recognized cause, just cause for a war in just war theory. So if the war is an attempt to avert an injury, right? It is a just war. Self-defense is the only reason recognized as a just cause in international law. It's the same in personal law, right? In American law, if someone's coming after you to kill you, you're allowed to kill that person. It's the only time you're allowed to kill a person, is in self-defense. Similar in war. A little bit more detail comes into play with international law about just war. It's not just that the cause is just, like I'm fighting this war because I need to protect my citizens, I need to defend myself. But there's a few more little elements. I'll just tick them off so you know them. One is that it's a legitimate authority. The war is fought by an entity that has the authority to fight wars, so like a state. The right intention. This is important, that the entity intends to achieve the just cause and is not using the war as an excuse to achieve some wrongful end. So for example, you might, like if we were going to talk about the Israel-Hamas war, once we determine that it's a just war, which I think we'll be able to do pretty quickly, if Israel's actually going into this war, not really for self-defense, but because it wants to annex Gaza and turn it into another neighborhood of Jerusalem for overflow of, Haredi population growth, that would not be a just war. Reasonable prospects of success. This one, maybe we could debate, but the war is sufficiently likely to achieve its aim, meaning you can't go into a war, even a war of self-defense, if you know that you can't achieve your aim of defending yourself. Proportionality, we're going to talk a lot about that when we talk about justice in war, but it's also an element of just war, of going into a war that is a just war, is that the morally weighted goods achieved by the war outweigh the morally weighted bads that it will cause. And also the notion of last resort or necessity, that there's no other less harmful way to achieve the just cause. So the main number one criteria for a war to be a just war is that it is a war of self-defense. And we can't say in engaging in a just war, we can't say, once we're in a war, all bets are off the table. Don't talk to me about morality in war. War is a dirty game. War is is chaos. Like, all bets are off once you're in the fog of war. Just like carpet bomb all of Gaza, turn it into a parking lot, and you'll hear this. That's not accepted in both international law, nor is it accepted in the code of the IDF and our own moral standards that we set for ourselves, nor is it acceptable in Jewish values and in Torah. And you might also hear, not just that, oh, war is a dirty business and innocent people suffer in war. You're not going to only hear that, but sometimes you will hear the argument, if our enemy is immoral, if we're fighting against animals, then why do we have to fight by the rules of morality and justice? If any innocents are harmed in the course of this war, it's not our moral problem, it's their moral problem. So all bets are off. That is also not allowed by international law. The unethical nature, the immorality of your enemy does not excuse you from upholding moral standards of war. So this option, carpet bomb Gaza, women, baby, animals, children, and it's Hamas's moral fault, not our moral fault, that's not an option. Nor is it an option morally to say, there's no way for us to engage in a war against Hamas because Hamas is embedded in a civilian population, and any war that we engage in Gaza will result in civilian casualties. So no war. And you're going to hear this, and you heard this even before a single bomb was dropped. You heard calls for ceasefire before the war even started. That's a radical position as well. And it's a radical position that doesn't adhere to, I don't believe, the Jewish values of power and the obligation, the moral obligation to protect your own life, nor in international law or laws of democracy, the obligation of a state to protect their citizens. But there is a middle ground between these two extreme poles, and that's what we're going to call just war theory. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So before I go deeply into our topic, any questions about the overall framing, the Jewish values, the distinction between just war and justice in war? Any clarification questions? Okay, I think that I'm gonna, yes.
When we are talking about being proportional.
Okay, we're gonna get to proportionality.
Okay.
We haven't done that yet. Okay, let me continue, and then I'll take lots of questions throughout. Yes.
Where does all of this encompass the practice of taking hostages?
Taking hostages in war is illegal. It's a war crime. Hamas has committed many, many war crimes. One of them is taking hostages. So we're going to talk about that. Justice in war is what you're asking. Hamas's war was unjust because when they attacked, it was not in self-defense, and they also did not follow any of the principles of just war, which the number one principle is the principle of distinction, which means that we distinguish between combatants and innocent civilians. Hamas broke every possible war crime. The problem is that Hamas is a terrorist organization, so they're not going to be brought up on war crime charges because they're not an entity that's recognized as a state. So one of the challenges, before we even get into your questions about proportionality and what Hamas has done, is the challenge that Israel has faced since the 1990s. And it's part of the work that's been at the core of the moral philosophers at the Hartman Institute, the primary one being Moshe Halbertal, who was the author of the IDF Code of Ethics. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He's a philosopher. He teaches at NYU, at Harvard, and Hebrew University, and he does a lot of writing and teaching on asymmetrical warfare and the ethical dilemmas that happen with asymmetrical warfare. So what is asymmetrical warfare, and why do we need to know about it? Asymmetrical warfare is, ever since Hamas started blowing up buses, right, after the Oslo Accords, the first intifada, the second intifada, those are examples of asymmetrical warfare. In normal warfare, where the rules of war laid out by the Geneva Convention, right, the legitimate rules of engagement in war, assume that you have two legitimate actors, two armies that represent states, with armies where the soldiers are wearing uniforms to distinguish themselves from civilians, and they're fighting on a war front, meaning on a battlefield. They're not fighting inside a kindergarten where there are 5-year-olds. They're not fighting in, a pizza parlor on a major city shopping district. They are fighting on a battlefield. There's a war front, and there's a distinction between soldiers and non-combatants. Asymmetrical warfare, where you have a terrorist organization that is blowing up a bus or is sending rockets indiscriminately into anywhere. Rockets sent into, maybe it'll land on a kindergarten, maybe it'll land on a military base, but it's being sent indiscriminately. It erases both aspects of traditional warfare. And so the additional challenge of an asymmetrical war is that often terrorists waging that war will then embed themselves in civilian populations, which makes it very difficult for the legitimate state actor, in this case Israel, to respond in a way that's proportionate. Because any amount of response, if a terrorist enemy is embedded in the civilian population, will result in collateral killing, sometimes called collateral damage, but we know what we mean when we say collateral damage. We mean people are killed who we are not targeting. They're innocent civilians. But how do you wage war in that way? And so that became the big dilemma of the IDF. How do we wage war in this era of asymmetrical warfare? Last component of asymmetrical warfare that I want to lay out for you is that in asymmetrical warfare, often it involves a lot of street by street, hand by hand combat by very small units. When you think about Hiroshima or Dresden, the major moral decisions about whether an action in war is just happens at a very high level of command. You have like the president of a country or the chief of staff, the head of the army making a major decision. Do we drop the big bomb on Hiroshima or not? Do we bomb Dresden or not? The problem in fighting in an asymmetrical war is that often you're on the ground in small units confronting individual terrorists that are hiding in civilian populations. And so the moral weight of decision-making falls on individual soldiers or very small units on the ground to say, can I bomb that building? Can I shoot this rocket in this direction? And so that was the reason why the IDF had to develop their code of ethics and train soldiers in these steps to determine whether or not actions within a war are proportionate, whether or not actions in a war are moral and legal according to international law. And it had to be moral reasoning that they could make in a second, because yes, there is the fog of war. There's some truth to this, that once you're in a war, things happen and there's fear, there's human error, there's difficulty in assessing targets on the ground. So the training has to be so careful that the instincts of soldiers and the instincts of commanders on the ground will be able to go through this moral checklist. And I remember Moshe Halbertal, even in the 90s, I was sitting at Hartman in Jerusalem and he was teaching all of us about this. And he said, picture yourself as a soldier he was talking about the West Bank, a particular incursion in the West Bank. You're turning around an alley, someone's shooting at you from a window, you're making a decision in a moment. You can't pull out some code of ethics and have like a 10-point checklist, like, oh, did I check this? Did I check? No. It has to be like boom, boom, boom. So that was, in fact, the theory behind the code of ethics, and it's based on both international law and the IDF, the spirit of the IDF. So let's read it together, and then I'll take you through the points of each step. So let's start on page 3. On page 3. Let's start with the overall mission of the IDF. The IDF stands for, anyone? Okay, so we've already met criteria number 1, Israel Defense Forces. The purpose of the IDF is defense. We're only going to engage in just wars. We're not an army of expansion. We're not trying to take over Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. Nope. We are here to defend our citizens, to defend the existence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of the state of Israel, to protect the inhabitants of Israel, and to combat all forms of terrorism which threaten the daily life. Okay. I think everyone agrees, even on the international stage on some level, that certainly the United States agrees, that the atrocities of Hamas on October 7th and the threat that they unveiled was an existential threat to the integrity of the territory of the state of Israel, to the lives and security of its inhabitants, and that combating Hamas as a terrorist threat is a just war. But once we've started a just war, the question is, how are you going to fight it justly? And how are you going to fight it justly when they're embedded in a civilian population? They don't wear uniforms to distinguish themselves. So how are we going to do this? First of all, the spirit of the IDF, I've highlighted this, the 3rd paragraph on page 3. The spirit of the IDF is the identity card of the IDF values, which should stand as the foundation of all the activities of every IDF soldier on regular or reserve duty. The spirit of the IDF and the guidelines of operation resulting from it are the ethical code of the IDF. The spirit of the IDF will be applied by the IDF, its soldiers, its officers, its units and corps to shape their mode of action. They will behave, educate, and evaluate themselves and others according to the spirit of the IDF. this idea that it's an identity card, there's actually a laminated card that IDF soldiers wear in their pockets. That's a piece of this longer IDF code of ethics, and it's called the purity of arms, Tohar HaNeshek. We're going to see it in a minute on the next page. But I wanted you to see in the longer, and you can find this code of ethics on the IDF website or the Israeli government website in both Hebrew and in English. This is a public document, and I think I brought the full code. Paragraph 4 that says the spirit of the IDF draws on 4 sources. You see that? Everyone with me?
Yes.
Okay, the tradition of the IDF and its military heritage as the Israel Defense Forces. The tradition of the State of Israel, its democratic principles, laws, and institutions. The tradition of the Jewish people throughout their history, universal moral values based on the value and dignity of human life. So you can see that the authors of the code of the IDF are not only citing international law as their sole source of ethics, but they're drawing from the aspirations of Israel that it set out for itself in its Declaration of Independence, Jewish values, democratic values. And then on the top of page 4, human dignity is one of its values. And it says the IDF and its soldiers are obligated to protect human dignity. Every human being is of value, regardless of his or her origin, religion, nationality, gender, status, or position. That's the Tselem Elohim. Human dignity is used a lot in Israeli law. There's a basic law, which is kind of constitutional law in Israel, even though Israel doesn't have a constitution, but there's a basic law of human dignity that is meant to protect the equality and the freedoms of all human beings that are citizens of Israel, regardless of their race, religion, ethnicity, etc. And that also applies to the way that they engage in combat. And the last thing that we need to look at is the purity of arms. This is in Hebrew, Tohar HaNeshek. Tohar means purity. Tohar HaNeshek. This is the card, the laminated card, and when you're going into battle and you're turning that corner in the alleyway, this is what Moshe Halbertal meant when he said, I need a quick and dirty checklist. Basically 3 things. It's not 10, it's not 20, it's not a 50-page document, it's 3 things. Let's read it together, and then I'm going to write up the 3 things here. The IDF servicemen and women will use their weapons and force only for the purpose of their mission, only to the necessary extent, and will maintain their humanity even during combat. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are not combatants or prisoners of war, and will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. Okay, read it again quietly to yourself while I get my board ready. Here we go. Oh, here we go. Okay. So we're going to talk about the following principles.
While you're getting your board ready, can I tell a funny story that will exactly talk about this?
Please.
So one of our nephews is in Gaza and the other is a tank driver in Lebanon. And literally, when he turned a corner in his tank on his way up to the Lebanese border, he knocked off the side view mirror of a car that was parked there. And he's on his phone or whatever they're using to call in and say, what should I do? Should I leave a note? Do I apologize? What should I do? I disturbed his property.
So funny.
The commander said, no, you just keep going.
That is a funny story. Very good, very good. And thank you for filling the space. Talk amongst yourselves, so Michelle help me. Okay, so these are our 3 principles. Lickety split, I'm a soldier. I've been trained in the army to embody these values and to instinctively do that calculation, that moral calculation in my mind when I'm confronting the enemy on the battlefield? Necessity, distinction and avoidance, proportionality. What do these mean? Let's take them one at a time. So, the principle of necessity. The principle of necessity teaches us that force should be applied only as necessary to the mission. It's very simple and very basic. This was also part of international law of war. If you have to destroy something in order to fulfill your moral obligation for self-defense, you can't go around breaking and destroying other things just because you're angry or just to wreak revenge. So let's say you are a soldier going into Gaza looking for rocket launchers, and you find a rocket launcher in a house. This is a bad example, but all right, let's say you find a chest of weapons that are being hidden under a kid's bed. We saw this, right? And you're the soldier going house by house, trying to defend yourself and doing what is necessary for your mission. You're only allowed to do what's necessary for your mission. You found weapons under the kid's bed? Great. Destroy the weapons, seize the weapons, but you don't get to smash the kid's bed, break the TV on your way out, and set fire to the garden because you're angry or as revenge. That's an unprofessional and unethical army, an incompetently trained army. And the IDF talks about this a lot, and I've heard, and I can give testimony, people who talk in the world about how IDF operates are usually not people that know IDF officers, that know the people that train IDF officers in their moral obligations. It is not true that the IDF indiscriminately destroys houses out of revenge. Every action of the IDF is deliberated upon by a legal unit that has to approve the different military actions to make sure that they are abiding by international law. And the questions they're going to ask themselves are, number one, is this necessary to fulfill my mission? So you can only, and this becomes particularly challenging when you're talking about bombing from the air. When you're on the ground and you're in the house, it's a little easier to distinguish between what's necessary for my job and what's just revenge or anger. Yes?
How do you justify then the mass amount?
Good, we're getting to proportionality, so stick with me. Yes, yes, yes. I promise we're getting to mass bombings, big craters, hospitals.
Just the
Yeah?
tractors that come in and tear the house down.
That's, okay, the question of the demolition of houses as a deterrence for terrorism, I'm not going to deal with maybe at all tonight, but not yet, because it's not the topic, it's a different topic. And it's really important for us to recognize that there's a difference between the Israel-Hamas war and the question of the occupation in the West Bank and the fight against terrorism. I'll maybe get to it a little later, but can I put a pin in it? Because I want to make sure that we're first talking about engaging in war against Hamas, currently in Gaza, and we will get to it, I promise. But I want to start with, if you're using firepower on the ground, it's usually easy for you to deal with the question of necessity and to know genuinely, do I need to shoot this gun to protect my life, or am I shooting this gun to punish this person? And there's kind of a continuum between professionalism and morality. If I'm being professional and doing my job, I seize those guns, I don't demolish the TV on my way out. Easy. But what about from the air? When I'm dropping a bomb, you know, the question of, is dropping this bomb necessary to fulfill my mission to defeat Hamas, protect my citizens? That is, I think, maybe impossible to talk about without talking about the next two elements of what makes fighting a just war justly. So let's talk about the principle of distinction. Distinction is that tells us that a soldier should only aim its weapon towards combatants or those who pose a threat to him or to Israeli civilians. So you can't target, even if, and by the way, distinction and avoidance trumps necessity. And this maybe we'll come back to with the question of the demolition of houses of terrorists, because there's a moral debate in Israeli society about whether that's a good practice or not, or a legal practice or not. But let's say our necessary mission is to find Sinwar and to kill the head of Hamas, because we know that that would dismantle the Hamas capability to function as an organized army, and it would protect Israelis. Okay, that's a just cause. We can go and try to kill that Hamas leader. So if killing, wait, I'm trying to think of a good analogy for how this trumps this. If killing Sinwar's granddaughter, maybe he has like a favorite 5-year-old granddaughter, if holding a gun to her head and threatening to kill her, or even killing her, would enable us to get Sinwar and kill him, then we're meeting the requirement of necessity, because it is necessary to kill Sinwar. But because I can never use firepower intentionally against a non-combatant, and I must do everything in my power to avoid causing harm to non-combatants, even if it would help my mission, then the answer is no. So that's the principle of distinction. You can't tell a terrorist, if you bomb yourself, I will murder your family afterwards. Even if that would be a really powerful form of deterrence. You can't murder their family afterwards. Can you tractor their house afterwards? If it's a form of deterrence, because it's necessary to deter terrorists in order to protect our society. That's necessary. That's a real question. Is that doing everything in our power to avoid causing damage to innocents and their property and their dignity? Proportionality is the biggest question. It's what we hear about the most. By the way, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around, but one last thing before we move on to proportionality, which will be the biggest sticking point about all the bombs in Gaza. Distinction is also somewhat of a sticking point in this current battle in Gaza, because the question is, how do you distinguish between who is a legitimate target, who is an actual enemy that's threatening you, who counts as a Hamas combatant and terrorist, and who is an innocent civilian? In that original graph that I drew, some people on what I will call the radical right would say there are no such thing as innocent civilians in Gaza. All of the people living in Gaza are guilty. Look, they gave out candy. Look, they celebrated and they're happy. They're all guilty. That is not a legitimate moral position, and it's against international law. The 5-year-old in Gaza, even if they took candy after Hamas committed atrocities on October 7th, is not a combatant that we can target and kill. But it is still complicated, because in an asymmetrical war where your enemy is not distinguishing themselves with a uniform, who counts as a combatant? We know that the terrorists that broke through the gate and committed atrocities, they count, but what about the taxi driver that drove the terrorists to the gate? Do they count? What about the bankers that funded the terrorists? Do they count? These questions are questions that the IDF has been deliberating since the 90s, when they started fighting Hamas as a terrorist organization, these exact questions. Along the chain of causation of a bus bombing in the middle of Jerusalem, who are the combatants that the IDF can go after and kill, while still maintaining their own moral principles and international law about who is a legitimate target? So it's a little bit complicated, but I think we can handle this complication and err on the side of avoiding civilians when we can. better to err on the side of not committing murder, and I think that's what Israel has often tried to do. But the real difficulty is the question of proportionality. So let's unpack this. Let me start with the definition of proportionality in international law. How does proportionality work? Proportionality in law, in just war theory, says that if you are committing an act in war that has the possibility of harming innocents, even the likelihood that there will be innocent people who are killed in that act of war, if the military gain, the military advantage that you achieve through committing that war act outweighs the anticipated collateral killing of innocents, it is proportionate. That is what's written in the Geneva Convention. It is confusing because it's a lot of words, but let's unpack it. What does it not mean? I'll tell you what it does not mean. It does not mean that Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis, so we get to kill 1,200 Hamas combatants. That is not proportionality according to international laws of war or according to Israel's use of international laws of war in its own just war theory and code of ethics. That's not how proportionality works in war, guys. Let me tell you something. If ISIS or Al-Qaeda comes and bombs the World Trade Center and kills 2,000 people, how many people did the United States kill in its battle against Al-Qaeda? A few hundreds of thousands of people. Now, some of those you could go back and question. Was it proportionate to drop bombs in Afghanistan in certain ways, and hundreds of people killed at this wedding, and hundreds of people killed at this funeral? Countries face this dilemma when they go in to fight terrorist enemies, but you are allowed to kill 500,000 Al-Qaeda terrorists to prevent one American civilian from being killed again. Proportionality does not have to do with numbers. Proportionality has to do with unintentional collateral killing of innocent civilians. So, this whole it's worse than annoying, this perverse count that you will hear on cable news channels of, 3 Israelis were killed by Hamas terrorists in a bus bombing, and 38 Palestinians were killed by Israeli soldiers. And they always say Palestinians. They don't say Hamas terrorists were killed. They say 38 Palestinians were killed by the IDF in clashes in Jenin. And 3 Israelis were killed in the bus bombing. That's not a fair use of the concept of proportionality. If Israel has to fight against terrorism and 38 terrorists are killed, even if 0 Israelis were killed, that is a just use of power. Do we all agree with that? But what happens when, in this current war, where it's over 20,000 have been killed in Gaza? We don't know for sure, but let's say it's 20,000. And let's say 11,000 are innocent civilians and 9,000 are actual Hamas soldiers. Now you might immediately say, oh, genocide, disproportionate. But we have to unpack what do we mean by proportionality in just war. It could be that there are cases where Israel did not follow all 3 of these important moral processes in their decision makings. And in every incursion in Gaza, there is a investigation by the IDF after the war, and every action in the war is evaluated. And when necessary, soldiers are brought up on charges of war crimes. In every war, there are going to be criminal soldiers, just like in America. There are going to be individuals that do murder people. There are going to be individuals that do exact revenge with their weapons, and they don't only use their weapons for necessity. Those soldiers need to be punished in order for the army to maintain its moral credibility and to maintain its stature as a professional army. But the question is on the principle of proportionality. This is how it works. If you are needing to, I'm trying to think of the best way to begin this. All right, I think it's going to be easiest if I do this with an art. I'm very bad at art, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay. So let's say everyone's going to remember necessity, distinction, and proportionality, because I want to draw a fake Gaza alley. Okay, so let's say we have, the inner city of Gaza, and we've got like this little alleyway. It turns to another little alleyway with other buildings. Okay. And we've got a sniper, a Hamas sniper on the roof. And shooting at this unit of IDF officers on the ground. So, we are in an asymmetrical micro-war. And in an asymmetrical micro-war, we can't wait for the commanders on high, like Dresden or Hiroshima, to say, oh yes, you can shoot a rocket and bring down this building. Each unit on the ground is going to have to make moral assessments: necessity, distinction, proportionality. So we've got this little troop. They've been sent in the ground on Gaza with a mission. And the mission is to find the site of the rocket launchers that are going in towards Sderot in Israel, and to locate them and to destroy them. That's a legitimate war aim because it's necessary for self-defense. While they're going in the ground, they're going to be searching, or they have intel, hopefully. There is a Hamas sniper on the roof that is shooting at them. So now, let's be soldiers and go through our Tohar HaNeshek, coat of arms that's in my pocket. Necessity. I need to kill this sniper to stay alive. Yep, got it. Okay, necessity, I got it. Distinction. I can tell that he is a combatant because he's shooting at me. Okay, great, I got necessity, I got distinction. Proportionality. I'm over here, and like any, good army, I've got lots of different kinds of artillery. I could try from here with my rifle to exactly shoot this guy and kill him, but I'm too far away. So I have to use bigger artillery. Now I might have a little shoulder to air missile. I'm in Israel, so I've got lots of great different weapons. If I shoot my shoulder to air missile and take down this building, then I have killed the sniper that's threatening me. And I said, necessity and distinction, I'm allowed to aim my weapon at a combatant to protect myself. But what's the problem? If I take down this whole building, who's in it? So in this particular scenario, let's say we don't know who's in it. Could be there's 20 civilians in this building. Could be there's 100 civilians in this building. Could be there's 10 Hamas terrorists also in this building, but I'm not concerned about that right now, because if I'm going to meet my final criteria of proportionality, I have to imagine to myself, if there's a 5-year-old in the bottom of this building, is it proportionate for me to take out this whole building to kill this one Hamas sniper? What if this one Hamas sniper is Sinwar, right? So there's all these different calculations. So in general, one of the things that will often happen and this I learned directly from one of the IDF commanders that trains soldiers in the code of ethics, is that the necessity of intel and how critical it is to have good intel. If you don't have good intel, then you can't act in this moment. So what soldiers will do in this moment, and this is why IDF soldiers die in Gaza, is because they don't just carpet bomb Gaza, because they're not allowed to do that by the code of the IDF and by international law, and because they're not terrorists. So they don't just carpet bomb everything, they go in to get more intel. So I would have to go in carefully, avoiding the sniper, and try to get into the building to make sure there's not a kindergarten in there. By the way, I've already dropped leaflets, I've already called cell phones, I've done all the things I can do as the IDF, the moral army that I aspire to be. Everything, we made a humanitarian corridor, try to get civilians out, but we know there are civilians. So at what point do you say the anticipated civilian casualties that might happen from the bomb I send is worth it in this calculus of the military aim that I will achieve? Once you've done everything you can in your power to avoid, by sending leaflets, by opening international by humanitarian corridors, and by using your intel, can you take down this building? Taking down this building is different than calling your backup in the Air Force and saying, you know what, let's not just take down this building, I don't really like this sniper, let's just take down this neighborhood, just send the biggest bomb and just wipe out the whole neighborhood so I don't have to worry about any snipers, and then I'll have more free room to walk around. That's obviously also not allowed. But this gets really challenging because how do we see, and some of you have already mentioned, what do you do about these big holes that you're seeing on the news? Well, there's a few problems with the Hamas war, because it's not just the sniper on top of the building, it's the whole tunnel system underneath the building that you can only dismantle with very large bunker-busting bombs that make very large holes. There's no way to fight this particular war with its military goal of defeating Hamas and dismantling it as a power in Gaza without really big bombs, because there's no way to get those tunnels destroyed without really big bombs. So proportionality becomes especially difficult. And so those first few weeks of the war, when Israel was sending huge bombs, and the pictures are devastating and horrific, you might say, off the bat in week 2, Israel already violated all the rules of international law on proportionality. But not necessarily. Because proportionality, again, it's not about numbers to numbers. Proportionality is about, in part, how much did you do to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties? So that's going to be a debate. Did Israel do enough in those first few weeks to warn civilians to leave, to give them enough time to leave, and then to send bombs to parts of northern Gaza that were necessary for the mission of the war? Necessary meaning, I must do this for my self-defense. I must do this to defeat Hamas as a terrorist threat, to stop the bombs, by the way, to stop the indiscriminate rockets that are being sent into Israel and threatening my civilian population. And when I did those things, dropping bombs and then eventually in the ground, am I making sure that I'm only using my power for the necessity of this war and not out of revenge? That I'm doing everything possible to distinguish who is a combatant and who's not, and that when possible, I'm only doing actions of war where the advantage outweighs the downside of possibly harming innocent civilians. That's how proportionality works, and it's going to be a real debate about whether Israel upheld its obligations to proportionality, and that is the debate. I mean, the debate in The Hague is a farce. It's like a charade, a kangaroo court going on over there, because you could hold Israel accountable, and Israel holds itself accountable. You could make the argument, possibly, that Israel has some moral failings in the war without saying that they're committing genocide. They're not committing genocide. I mean, it's like not even remotely worth discussing. I don't need to take time tonight to talk about that. You know, genocide is the intention to wipe out an entire population. If Israel intends to commit genocide, they're really bad at it. They're really bad at it, because if you want to kill an entire civilian population of a certain ethnic group, like, you wouldn't let aid trucks in, you wouldn't open humanitarian corridors, you wouldn't drop leaflets, you wouldn't but proportionality, I think, is a fair question, and it was a question in 2014. It's a question in every war that Israel is forced to fight against an asymmetrical terrorist organization, and it's put in an almost impossible situation where it knows that it cannot defend itself without harming innocent civilians on the other side. But if anyone were to say that its hands are tied and it can't fight, that's that pacifist answer, which is also morally problematic. So there are no great choices in this war, but I wanted to lay out for you, and then we'll take lots of questions and talk through it more. I wanted to lay out for you the questions of, did I use my weapon for the necessary purpose or not? Did I aim my weapon at a legitimate target or not? And did I do everything in my power to minimize collateral damage that will come from my action? And is the collateral damage proportional to the military advantage that I achieved? That's how both international law works, that's how the code of the IDF ethics works, and that's the basis in which Israel will be evaluated by Israel in this particular war. Okay, questions, yes?
Yes, I have two questions. One, how do you apply these principles of ethics in the case of the killing of the 3 hostages that unfortunately
Yeah.
were
It's a great question. Okay, such a good question. That horrific, heartbreaking, terrible, terrible day. This is my understanding of what happened. It will absolutely be investigated. My understanding is that the IDF soldiers were operating in a part of northern Gaza that had been completely cleared of non-combatants, to their knowledge, and that the only living human beings in that area were Hamas fighters, and they were told, if you see anyone, shoot on sight, because it was their understanding. If we put back up the 3 principles, it was their understanding that it was both, all right, everyone help me, so that I know that you've learned. What's the first principle? Necessity. Distinction and proportionality. So if you're operating in a battlefield where your commanders have told you shoot on sight because any living person in this part is definitely a combatant, then we've gotten both. It's necessary for us to kill all the Hamas soldiers because they're our enemies and they're threatening us, and anyone in this area was understood to have been a Hamas soldier. Also because Hamas soldiers are known to do tricky things like play audio of babies crying to lure soldiers in so they can ambush them, or dressing up like hostages, or waving flags. Like, you know, those are things that Hamas terrorists do. So that's most likely what led to this accident. There's others who would say, no, this is actually a sign of part of the kind of moral corruption that is happening in the IDF right now out of the great rage, fear and rage that a lot of IDF soldiers have, in which they're a little trigger happy and they are not doing what is necessary in the realm of distinction, and they're erring on the side of killing everyone, even people that might be innocent civilians, and that this incident of killing hostages shows that the soldiers are not doing what they need to do in the realm of distinction. And we will only know after the investigation in that case. But what we know from the IDF messaging is that the leadership of the IDF is saying that the soldier that killed those hostages was not following protocol, that it is not the protocol of the IDF to shoot people that are not carrying weapons and that are waving flags. I was just trying to explain how it could have happened. And my understanding is that it could have happened even if it was a moral soldier that was trying to do what they thought was right, because they were in an area where they really thought there's no one left but Hamas, and Hamas is doing everything they can try to do to trick us and ambush us, but it was not protocol, because the protocol is you do not ever aim a weapon against a non-combatant, and you don't use force against a non-combatant.
And the second question that I have, you mentioned that in the initial stage of the war, there was heavy bombardment to destroy the underground facilities.
And the above ground,
In
both.
the underground. In today's newspaper, the New York Times, we learned that there are hundreds of thousands of miles of underground.
I know, so this is the
Does
problem.
it mean that because that exists there, they need to go back and destroy everything because there are hundreds of thousands?
So, this is part gets, okay, so the question was, now that they've discovered that there's hundreds of thousands of miles of tunnels all under Gaza, is there any way to achieve the aim of this war without carpet bombing all of Gaza? And I think that that's gets back to the original question of just war. Is it possible to achieve the goals of this war at all? Some people, even Jewish people, who might say, we shouldn't have gone into Gaza, it's not because they don't believe Jews have the right to defend themselves. Some people would say, Jews have a right to defend themselves, but this was not a war that was possible to win. We had to come up with a different way to do it. I'm not someone that believes that. I think this war was necessary and morally obligatory for us to fight. But I'm also not an engineer. So I would like to believe that there are engineers in the IDF that know how to dismantle this system without having to destroy the entire Gaza. There are in this tunnel system like main arteries, and there are main entrances and exits. And I would like to believe that there will be a way, since they're on the ground and getting intel and seeing these things, that there will be a way for them to destroy this tunnel system without destroying all of Gaza. But
desalinated water.
yeah, I mean, this is why the IDF is saying it's going to take another year to finish this war. They're moving into stage 3 now. I'm sure most of you are following all the same news I'm following, but stage 3 could go on for a year or 2 years because of exactly what you've said. They can't carpet bomb the entire place because that would what's the word? When you go against, that would violate principles 2 and 3 of their own code of ethics. So they have to find another way. So I would like to believe they'll find that other way through flooding the tunnels. Now, the question of what do you do about the fact that hostages are still there and probably are being kept in the tunnels has been keeping me up at night for all of these months of how do you weigh this moral dilemma and the different moral obligations that you have to do everything possible to redeem captives, which is one of the most important mitzvot of the Jewish tradition, our obligation to redeem captives, and our obligation to defend ourselves against a mortal enemy that's threatening our existence. And how do you do both at the same time is, I don't know. But, okay, let's take a few more questions. There's so much. All right, we're gonna go in the back and then these 3 in this row. Yes?
Okay, yeah, Henry Kissinger said that when it came to Hiroshima, and he's a conservative Jew, a very practicing conservative Jew, that it was morally necessary to bomb Hiroshima because the information they had, if they went to use the way the IDF street by street, if they landed like they did in Normandy, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans would be killed. So that the loss of 1 million, 2 million, quote, innocent civilians, if there's such a thing in a state like that, was worth it and was proportionate, because the benefit, we looked at it from the perspective of saving hundreds of thousands of men. So the question I have, when you look at these circumstances, how many 25-year-old Jewish IDF young men have to die?
Right. So I suspect,
Bomb Gaza?
right, I suspect that the extensive bombing that was happening in the beginning of the war was taking that calculus into account for proportionality. The fact that less than 200 IDF soldiers have died, every one of those soldiers who has died is a personal family trauma to the Jewish people, because everyone knows these soldiers. But one thing that's really important for us to think about when we think about justice in war is that the people making decisions about just war cannot make decisions the way a parent would make a decision about their child. They have to make these decisions in a cold moral calculation, which is really hard in Israel because everyone knows every soldier. But if I drew that picture again of the buildings and those little soldiers, if those little soldiers over here were your nephews, you would say, send the biggest bomb, just take out the whole neighborhood. But you're not the one making the moral decisions, and that's why you're not the one making the moral decisions. So it's really complicated, but I do think you're right. There was a certain amount of mass bombing in the beginning that probably killed thousands of civilians, where the argument on the IDF side is it is still proportionate to that unintended but anticipated civilian casualties, meaning we're not trying to kill civilians, but we know it probably will happen, and yet it is proportionate with the necessity for our military aim. But once that happened and it enabled soldiers to come in and operate in the field relatively safely, to the extent that we've lost less than 200 soldiers on the ground, they're doing very well, and I'm listening to Israelis in the know talk about how well they're doing in terms of that number of losses, is maybe due to some of that original action. So yeah, I think that's a good comparison. I think Dresden and Hiroshima and the first few weeks of this Gaza war, the people making moral decisions are talking about this. And then we have always the analysis after, the day after. Was Dresden moral? Was Hiroshima moral? Was the bombing of parts of Gaza, was it moral? Let's do this row and then we'll go on. Yeah, Michelle.
So I do want to go back to your little drawing.
Okay.
I picture your sniper back on top of the
Yeah.
building.
Okay. Let's draw.
There he is.
Here's our little nephews and our grandchildren, people that we love and know. Okay, and here's the
same Hiroshima principle that we just discussed, because if it's kill or be killed, it's number 5, is it not?
Yeah, so this is, no, it's not. I'm so glad you're raising this, Michelle. So this is what was controversial about Moshe Halbertal's version of the IDF Code of Ethics, and they're still talking about it in Israeli society. The Code of Ethics, as it was passed in 90, I forget if it was 98, I forget the year, but it was a revision of an earlier Tohar Neshek, an earlier version of the IDF Code of Ethics that didn't have this same language about do everything. And let's go back to it. It's on page 4, towards the bottom.
Number 2, where you said.
No, but I'm talking about, that's not the one that we need to look at. The one we need to look at is purity of arms, where it says, on the bottom of page 4, second to last paragraphs. IDF servicemen and women will use their weapons and force only for the purpose of their mission, only to the necessary extent, and will maintain their humanity even during combat. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are not combatants or prisoners of war, and will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. So that was the clause that was controversial. Because in the earlier version of the IDF Code of Ethics, it didn't say that. And you might have thought there was more ground for this little troop to send the big bomb to take down all 3 of these buildings, because they're being shot at. And this is Michael Walzer wrote a lot about this. It was Asa Kasher who was the original author of the first Code of Ethics, and then Moshe Halbertal wrote the revised Code of Ethics. And the debate was about the nature of IDF officers. Because you could say, like I'm sensing Michelle would like to say, every IDF officer is a citizen. Every IDF officer is like an innocent civilian in a sense that it's a citizen's army. This is my nephew, this is my grandchild. If someone is shooting at me, I have a right to defend myself and to kill them. But the difference is that once you wear an uniform and you are a soldier in an army, and Israel is a legitimate state actor and they're waging war and trying to follow international rules of war, they have to do everything in their power to protect civilians on the enemy side. And this was the big debate in Israeli society. Does the possible 5-year-old inside that building, does their life outweigh the life of my nephew? They're both human beings in the image of God. And the answer is yes. Yes, if I'm a soldier in an army, an innocent 5-year-old, I have to do everything in my power to avoid killing them, even if it means risking my life. And that's why these 3 guys have to go in a little closer to get eyes on this building to see if there's a 5-year-old before they take it down. So the answer is yes. And the question is, how much do you have to risk yourself? And that's why if you have a really professional army with really good intel and good Air Force backup and good communications, and you're well trained, you're not put in those positions too often where you have to literally sacrifice your life. You know, we're not sending soldiers into the army to martyr themselves on the altar of protecting civilian life. No, we're sending them into army with a professional job. We want them to act as professionally as possible, and you have to give them the ability to do their job morally and professionally. So that's why, you know, sometimes the fault is with the higher up in the command that didn't do the necessary pre-work in gathering intel or giving the right different artillery to the soldiers, you know, etc. But they are not allowed to say, doesn't matter if there's civilians there, I get to protect my life because I'm a human being. They're a soldier, and soldiers have duties. And one of the soldiers' duty is to do everything possible to avoid harming innocent life. And that's the real hard one. Yeah.
Yes, I believe that we are pursuing a just war and justice in war. I question whether every day that the soldiers can follow necessity, distinction, proportionality. Great idea. I'm not sure it happens every day.
Yeah.
My question is a little different.
Yeah.
I think that and it's a little off topic. My question is, I think if any other country had what happened to them on October 7th, happened to them, the reaction would have been accepted that they have to do whatever they have to do to wipe out a Hamas. I think that the world reaction is something unlike anything that I've grown up with ever, and I wonder to myself, I think that maybe this is just plain old-fashioned anti-Semitism, which I've been shielded from in my entire growing up life. I want to know your opinion about that conclusion.
That conclusion is 100% factual. There's no question that what's happening at The Hague and on college campuses and in the press and in the world is old-fashioned anti-Semitism. It's part of what has been so traumatizing to the Jewish people in the aftermath of October 7th, before Israel even laid feet on the ground in Gaza. We were seeing cries for ceasefire, cries of like, Israel is a terrorist state. I listened to it on my own son's campus at Northwestern. 2 weeks after October 7th, there was a rally for Students for Justice in Palestine, and they were chanting, Israel is a terrorist state, Israel's committing genocide. This is before we even started the war. So there's no question that what we're seeing is anti-Semitism. It's horrifying. I grew up in the 80s and 90s thinking that I won the lottery of Jewish history, and I was the lucky one, born in America, post-Holocaust, with the birth of the State of Israel, and I got to read about anti-Semitism in the history books and read about the Holocaust in the history books. And even after Tree of Life happened, which was such a personal trauma in our family, as many of you know, I still felt like, okay, crazy white supremacist, that was an anomaly, but I'm still that lucky lottery winner, and I'm living in this, golden age of American Jewish exceptionalism. And part of what was most horrifying to me after October 7th was the realization of the extent of anti-Semitism that is still alive and well in America. We knew it was alive and well in Europe and other places, but it's alive and well in America, in the very liberal communities that I belonged to, the elite academia, the progressive political causes. So it's a reckoning. It's a reckoning time. The double standard against Israel in the UN is something that we've been tracing for decades. And, grows right out of the Zionism is racism, Soviet anti-Semitism. And now we're seeing it in a new way, but I don't have a solution for how to combat it, but it is without question. Without question. There's no one that could argue, in my mind, rationally, why Israel would be the first and only country brought up on genocide charges. How could we list, Cambodia, Syria, you can name them off. How many countries have committed genocide that have not been brought up on genocide charges? And Israel, who is not committing genocide, is the first brought up on genocide charges just months after they experienced a genocidal attack. It's anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism. I'm sorry to rile you up, but there's no other way to explain it. So how do we deal with anti-Semitism is a different seminar. And what I will say to you in answer to your question is, even if Israel is being treated unfairly in the world, we still have to uphold our own moral standards. So we don't get to carpet bomb Gaza because the world hates us anyway, so who cares? Let's just do whatever we need to do to survive. That's not how we have ever operated, and that's not going to ensure the survival of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. It is an existential necessity for us to protect ourselves and defeat Hamas, and it is an existential necessity for us to stay a Jewish and democratic state. So that means we have to wage this war according to the rules of war and hold ourselves accountable in the places where we fail. And I just hope that I'm going to wrap up this evening and let people with questions come forward so you're not trapped here, those of you who wanted to leave at 7:30 when the program was supposed to end. So I will just say that I hope that what I've shared tonight helps you a little bit unpack some of what you're reading, and read with a grain of salt when you're reading the New York Times, which I do get and I do read. When you're watching cable news, when you're seeing what's happening in the world, know the aspirations that Israel has set out for itself in its own code of ethics. Know the impossible scenario of waging an asymmetrical war against a terrorist enemy that forces us to wage war in a place where we know there will be collateral damage, and know that Israel is trying its best to use power and force when necessary, with distinction and with proportionality. And if they're not living up to those standards, then they will need to and they are going to face a reckoning within their own society, but I don't think that means that the reckoning that the world is bringing to them is fair or just, or is even following the international laws and rules. So it's a complicated time. I know it's a painful time, and we are all carrying with us a lot of emotions, a lot of worry and fear, a lot of anger and resentment, and a lot of pain and grief. And we will keep here at HEJC, we will keep offering sessions to bring helpful knowledge, but I hope this will also be a place where you can come and just feel that you're being embraced, and that whatever you're feeling in this moment, you are not alone, and that the Jewish people, God willing, have survived so many difficult times in our history. We are a people who are resilient and resourceful, and we are right, and we have the truth. And so, God willing, we will be victorious, and Am Yisrael Chai. And I'll stay here for additional... I'll stay here for more questions for those that want to come up and I'm sorry I went late.